In this video, we will talk about spelling. First of all, what exactly is spelling? When we say spelling, what we mean is the production of a letter sequence in response to a phonological word form. So spelling means to come up with a series of letters that you can use to represent usually a word, but it doesn't have to be a known word. It can be any phonological word form. And this phonological word form can arise internally. In this way, you're trying to spell a word that you're thinking of yourself, or it can arise externally. So somebody else can tell you a word and ask you to produce the letter sequence. Now, when we say to produce a letter sequence, it is conceivable that you just recite the letters. You just say the letters one by one. This is not the usual meaning. So usually when we say spelling, we imply that the letter sequence is produced by writing. Writing means to put the letters on paper. So use a pencil and actually write the letters. So writing and spelling are not the same thing. When we evaluate spelling, we evaluate the letter sequence itself. When we evaluate writing, we may be evaluating other things. For example, whether the shape of the letters is regular, whether they fall on the same line, and other aspects also can be involved in writing when it comes to writing stories, such as the structure of the story, other kinds of conventions, and so on. And the reason I'm saying so much here is to make sure that we understand when we talk about spelling, it has to do with an expressive skill that produces a letter sequence. Now, this sequence may or may not correspond to the conventional way of writing that word. Each word has a conventional way. This is defined at two levels. So one set of conventions concern how phonemes and graphemes map onto each other. And if those conventions are followed, then a word can be spelled in such a way that is phonologically correct. But that's not all. In most alphabetic systems, there are additional conventions that dictate how specific words are spelled. In Norwegian, this, for example, includes a lot of silent letters and many other kinds of combinations that could be thought of as extensions or exceptions to the graphophonemic systematicity, but they're still part of conventional spelling. So when we talk about correct spelling, we are talking about comparing a produced letter sequence with what is conventionally accepted for this specific word. Okay, so that's what spelling is. Let's move on. Why is spelling important? Well, perhaps from a teacher's point of view, spelling is important because it is part of education, and it is a way in which one can demonstrate that they have been educated. But from our point of view, spelling is important because it shows us the workings of the mind in terms of reading development. Spelling is important because spelling develops along with learning to read. So as one is exposed to reading and practices reading over and over, and one's phonological awareness improves as a result in part of learning to read. So these things grow and they kind of take spelling with them. So spelling is an indication of your reading development. Spelling is actually a difficult thing. You have to come up with all the letters by yourself just by hearing a word or thinking about a word. If the representation of the orthographic form of the word in your mind is weak, then you may fail to produce the appropriate sequence of letters. So spelling is much more demanding than reading. In reading, all the letters are there in front of you. They're cues. You can use those cues in order to figure out what word is represented. In spelling, you have no cues. So spelling is also a very good indicator of the quality of your lexical representations. So spelling is very useful for us as a metric of reading development, both in terms of decoding and in terms of lexical quality. What is needed for spelling to develop? The first and most important thing is phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is even more important for spelling than it is for reading. And we already know that it is very important for learning to read. So one must have established phonological awareness so that one can think of phonemes in terms of units and then try to map each phoneme to the corresponding grapheme, which amounts to actually spelling. Of course, one also needs letter knowledge and a good understanding of the alphabetic principle. One must have knowledge of phonics, which is the specific graphophonemic mappings of one's language. And further on, with experience with reading, one becomes accustomed to other conventions and patterns that are found in the orthography of the language. Of course, the most important ones are, to repeat, phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and understanding of the alphabetic principle. How does spelling develop? Similar to word reading, spelling development has been described as a series of phases or stages. As in the case of reading, these aren't meant to be taken as a literal sequence, but more like qualitative descriptions of the behavioral manifestation of spelling. In the beginning, or the first stage, there is actually no spelling. But this is a very important stage because kids first need to realize that it is possible to put words on paper. That's a first major cognitive breakthrough. Now, kids understand that you can put words on paper, and then they also understand that words look like on paper is different from drawing. They understand they're not pictures. So kids, before they have any idea of what letters look like, before they have any idea of phonological awareness or of the alphabetic principle, they develop a solid idea that writing is about representing words on paper, and that is done with different kinds of shapes. So kids will draw as they normally do, and then for some of it, they will say it's writing, and it will look different. They will make different kinds of lines or different symbols. And that's the first stage where kids understand the concept of writing, that it is about representing words on paper with special kinds of symbols, although they don't know any of the symbols or they have no understanding of how this representation works. In this case, we have this representation, which is a letter to Santa. This is what the kid said that this letter says. And at this stage, it is common that kids can actually write their name, which they have learned in a stereotyped fashion. So they don't really understand, or they may not understand at all, how these particular shapes represent their name, although many kids learn to spell their own name early on, before they have any real understanding of the concept of spelling. Much further along the way, after kids have understood the alphabetic principle and learned the necessary letters, then they pass on to the stage where they can represent most of what they want to say. In this sample, we see that the kid is expressing something actually very well, although there are certain conventions that are not followed. For example, the special way that de should be spelled is not known. That O in this word is spelled with a different letter is not known. That this word, which is actually a very frequent word, is not the one we use here. That is not known. We need a different grammatical element, not this conjunction. So the kid is already becoming accustomed to some patterns. This is a strange pattern because this is actually a silent letter. So the child knows that this sounds O, but is not aware of which O it is. And of course, we don't have any knowledge of how double consonants are used. We have some writing omissions and so on. But overall, this is a very good spelling in which the child has almost correctly produced exactly what they want to say. So this is an alphabetic level in which the child can make full use of the alphabetic principle and knows the graphophonemic correspondences to be able to spell the words that they want to say. Before this stage is reached in this relatively final form, children may pass through partial alphabetic stages where they can only use some of the letters, or they can use letter names mixed with letter sounds, or they can only partially spell words. After this full alphabetic stage, one begins to see evidence of internalization of additional conventions. So the child stops spelling entirely phonologically and moves on to internalize further conventions. We see a first glimpse of that here, although otherwise this sample is in the alphabetic stage, and then we see further development. This kid is aware of some additional conventions, as we see here. The writing itself is also further developed, but there is still no understanding of the role of double consonants, which is a very demanding aspect of the Norwegian orthography, because doubling of the consonant doesn't really say anything about the consonant. We use the doubling of the consonant to signify something about the length of the preceding vowel, which is a very demanding cognitive process operation for the child to undertake. So this here is a child on the way to consolidated spelling and understanding of further orthographic conventions. But of course, there is still a long way to go. How is spelling learned? And how should it be taught? For the most part, spelling is learned by exposure. Of course, in the beginning, children are taught the graphophonemic rules. So they learn the sounds for each letter, and they learn to use that letter to represent that sound, which amounts to an understanding and implementation of the alphabetic principle. But even before that, through that and long after that, children are continuously exposed to orthographic patterns, starting with shared book reading, where children notice letters and letter patterns even before they know how to recognize and identify them. This exposure results in what is called statistical learning, by which children learn to distinguish between plausible or common letter patterns and uncommon or impossible ones. This has been demonstrated in children before they actually learn to write anything, and continues intensively as children are actually exposed to reading and read on their own. This results in learning the statistics of the orthographic system and internalizing the orthographic patterns, that is, the letter sequences that are encountered often or less often, and in what contexts that happens. So most of spelling is learned statistically after the basic graphophonemic rules are known. Things that are relatively simple and consistent can be taught as rules, and they can be learned as rules. However, actually seeing them used to spell correctly requires a lot of practice. It helps to have the rule in mind in the beginning stages of learning to apply it, But the good speller doesn't recite the rule every time they need to write something. They have internalized the rule by having applied it many times. For other kinds of systematic patterns, teaching the rules may not be very effective. Instead, it may be much more effective to expose the children to the regularities and ask them to spell repeatedly word families, that is, word with the same root that also carry the same spelling pattern, or words with the same suffixes that thereby carry the same spelling patterns. So spelling instruction must capitalize on the statistical nature of spelling and make sure that the children are explicitly exposed to the regularities, not just to recite them, but to practice them in context again and again. What other kinds of performance are associated with spelling? A child who's a good speller. What else do we expect the child to be good at? A child who's a poor speller. What else do we expect the child to be not so good at? What predicts spelling? In terms of longitudinal predictors, the most important one is phonological awareness. Indeed, it's more important and lasts longer than it does for reading development. In terms of concurrent associates, so things at the same time as the spelling measurement, this also includes phonological awareness, but also includes decoding, so reading development. Reading accuracy and fluency measures are very strongly associated with spelling, which makes a lot of sense because spelling is just a reflection of the level of reading development that is attained. Indeed, it has been found in the literature that if we select kids that are matched in their level of reading and phonological awareness, then their spelling performance is the same. Spelling depends entirely on the level of reading and phonological awareness development. So these are the strongest associates. And as we said, that makes spelling very important, as we can use spelling as an indicator of how far one is in their reading development, in the maturation of the reading system. An important corollary of this is that children with word level reading problems, that is, children with dyslexia, in other words, have spelling patterns and spelling performance that is entirely commensurate with the reading development. There is nothing special about dyslexic spelling. There is nothing qualitatively different about having reading difficulty, or dyslexia in other words, when it comes to spelling. So the spellings of children with dyslexia are like the spellings of typically developing children who are at the same level of reading and phonological awareness. It is difficult to match children on both reading and phonological awareness with younger ones because the amount of experience may differ a lot. But if the matching is done, then we see that the spelling is no different. So the spelling is just a reflection of having learned to read. This can be important for intervention because it implies we don't need to teach any special patterns to children with reading difficulties. We just need to teach the same things that are difficult in general. The stability of spelling performance is unfortunately relatively high. This means that someone who's a relatively good speller will probably remain a good speller throughout their reading development, and someone who's a relatively poor speller will probably remain a relatively poor speller throughout. This is very similar to the situation with reading fluency, which is also very longitudinally stable. This is bad news for intervention because it means that addressing spelling problems can be very challenging because they're persistent. Indeed, fluency and spelling problems are among the most persistent ones in dyslexia. These are the things that it takes longest to improve on and it's hardest to improve on. So spelling requires a lot of dedicated, intensive intervention that lasts for a very long time and may not be completely effective. This is also why spelling is one of the most persistent indices of reading difficulty, even if the other domains have been sufficiently improved that one doesn't stand out so much in their reading performance. How do we measure spelling performance? The most common way is to dictate words to children to write. When there is a word list to be dictated, in which there are words that are chosen for specific orthographic patterns, the words are dictated in isolation and then in context, so that the child knows which kind of word it is. It's completely disambiguated, but the child doesn't have to write down the sentence. So if you want the child to write the word ball, you say ball. He kicked the ball, ball. And so the child knows they're only required to write down the word. The sentence is given orally just for the context. And here is an example from a Norwegian test. Instead of dictating isolated words, each of which is specifically chosen, one may dictate an entire passage. In this kind of test, the examiner typically dictates punctuation. For example, when there are full stops, question marks, and so on. It is important that with both kinds of tests, the rate of progress is determined by the child. So you wait until the child has written what you've dictated before you dictate the next piece or the next word. It's also important that you don't say too much so that the child doesn't need to try very hard to remember and can concentrate on the spelling task. So depending on age, you will have to say a very few words at a time if you're dictating a whole passage. This is also why the word to be spelled is dictated again after the sentence context in the word list dictation tasks. How to evaluate performance in these kinds of tasks? The simplest and in fact, the most effective and useful index is to simply count the number of correct words. This has been found to be very reliable and indeed a valid measure of one's overall spelling performance. Another thing you can do is you can count the number of spelling errors. This differs from the first option because there may be more than one error on the same word. A lot of more complex schemes of scoring have been proposed in the literature. And that's because one can easily imagine that there are more serious errors and less serious errors in spelling. And it is true that there are qualitative differences in the kinds of errors one makes. However, recent studies have found that when it comes to scoring, so when one is just interested in finding out what the level of spelling performance is, adding more complex measures that take into account the severity of the errors or the distance of what is written from what is conventional does not add to the validity of the measure. So it is not necessary to take into account these graded scoring schemes. This is also very good finding for practical reasons because it means you don't need to spend time for any complicated scoring because just counting the number of correct words gives you all the information you need to decide about somebody's spelling level as long as the spelling test is properly made. However, it is true that spelling errors are different. They're different kinds, and they are classified, and they should be classified when you intend to go toward intervention, because different kinds of spelling errors may indicate different kinds of underlying weaknesses or different stages of reading and spelling development. And this has direct implications for planning intervention.